Good morning to you all. Just a quick reminder that this session is recorded and we will send out the recordings afterwards. But welcome to our Natural Capital webinar series. And today we will be covering Biodiversity Net Gain, or as it's commonly called, BNG. Speaking today will be my expert colleagues, so planning specialist James Dorrell and our environmental lawyer Callum Ross. To let you know, there will be opportunity for questions after their introductions, and if you would like to raise a question, do so please by the Q&A button within Zoom. Finally, we'll be glad to receive any feedback on today's session, and a form will be available at the end to assist. I mention this now as I always forget. So over to James.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Good morning, everyone. Today, Callum and I are going to be talking about the new Biodiversity Net Gain regime that's being introduced by the Environment Act 2021. The government has announced that this regime will come into force from January 2024 for major sites and April 2024 for small sites. This new regime will require all developments to provide a 10% biodiversity gain on the pre-development value of their site as part of the development and maintain this for 30 years. The way they will secure this is that every planning permission granted will be subject to a new condition that will require a biodiversity net gain plan to be submitted and approved prior to the commencement of development. This plan will have to set out how this mandatory 10% gain will be achieved and include information such as the steps taken to minimise the impacts on habitat, the pre-development biodiversity value of the site, the post-development biodiversity value of the site, and where this is not all achievable on-site, any off-site units or statutory credits are required to achieve this 10% gain. Before we get into the detail, I'll just run through a few of the main exceptions to this, which are on the screen now. It's important to note that not all of these exceptions are currently secured in the legislation, and these are what have been suggested in consultation, and we await the regulations to set these out in legislation. With regard to zero-rated developments, these are developments which have no pre-existing biodiversity value on site. You would not, of course, be able to have a 10% increase of zero, but it's been suggested that there will be policy implemented to set a minimum enhancement, which will be set out in units rather than as a percentage. Also, you'll see that small-scale self-build or custom-build plots are likely to be exempt from biodiversity net gain. However, where these form part are combined together to form part of a larger development or sit within a larger development, they will be subject to this regime as part of that whole site. Also, to qualify for the de minimis exception, you'll have to be within both of those parameters, i.e. under 25 square meters of area habitat impacted and under 5 meters of linear habitat impacted. And Callum will come on to explain what area habitats and linear habitats are. The government's initial publications did refer to 25 meters squared of area habitat, but DEFRA's subsequent guidance has announced that this is intended to actually be 25 square meters, and you'll see that that's quite a significant reduction in the de minimis area. So this regime is going to require all developments to provide a mandatory 10% gain in biodiversity on their developments. And as this is mandatory, there will be no ability to challenge this on viability grounds on this 10%. Local planning authorities will also be allowed to require an increased amount of biodiversity gain as part of their policies within their local plans. And we're seeing a number of local authorities requiring, for example, a 20% gain rather than a 10% gain. However, it might be possible to challenge these policy increases, i.e. the increase above the mandatory 10% on viability grounds on a development by development basis. The value of a site That is, the pre-development and post-development values will be calculated using a biodiversity metric that's published by the Secretary of State. The current metric in use is the Biodiversity Metric 4.0, published by Natural England, but recent announcements have suggested that there'll be a further update or new metric that will come into force prior to the implementation of the Biodiversity Net Gain regime. This metric calculates biodiversity value in units, which are the currency of biodiversity value. I'll now hand over to Callum, who will take you through biodiversity and the calculations.
Thanks, James. Okay, obviously there is a lot of talk about biodiversity net gain, but we really need to put this into the context of what biodiversity actually is. So there's multiple definitions, but I do like this one on the slide, which does nicely put it, and that biodiversity covers the variety of living species on Earth, including plants, animals, bacteria, and fungi. And many of these are actually being threatened due to human, or what we call anthropogenic activities, which is putting biodiversity across the globe at risk. Obviously, direct drivers for decline, changes in land and sea use, direct exploitation, so things like deforestation, climate change, so that's in the news a lot, pollution, and the invasion of alien species. I'm not talking about stuff coming in from space there. I'm talking about things like that have been in the recent news about mitten crab invasion, those types of things. Obviously, biodiversity net gain really, though, focuses on the first one of these, that is land use, and its impact and the requirement to now show a gain to reverse that decline. So how do we go about measuring biodiversity to highlight the impact and gain? Well, B&G is measured using a biodiversity metric, as James has said, and that's based on habitat features to calculate an overall biodiversity value. So Natural England has indicated that they'll use biodiversity metric 4, or as James has said, updated, so there'll be a new metric coming in, and that will be the basis for the statutory metric. So I'd advise anyone who has an interest in this to really go onto their website and read the metric. They've got some really, really great case studies in there, which takes that sort of techie part, which is quite hard to understand, but makes it much easier to read through and see how it might apply to your sites. The metric itself, that uses habitat features to calculate a biodiversity value, and that can be used by ecologists or developers carrying out a biodiversity assessment, developers who've commissioned a biodiversity assessment, planning authorities who are interpreting metric outputs in planning applications, landowners or land managers can also use it to provide biodiversity units from their sites to others. And even as well, they're talking about communities using it to understand the impacts of local developments on their local environment. So you might start to see local communities out in the wild using this metric, walking around, applying it. So the metric itself is used to assess the biodiversity unit value of an area of land to demonstrate the biodiversity net gains or losses in a very consistent way. And they'll account for direct impacts on biodiversity and compare those proposals for sites. So they'll compare it by way of creating or enhancing a habitat on site or off site. The units used by this metric come in 3 different types, and they're treated very separately. So we always have to keep that in mind. So these include area units, so that would be grasslands, hedgerow units, so that would be lines of hedges and trees, and watercourse units, so they are things like lakes, canals, and rivers. So it is really important to note here that area units, hedgerow units, watercourse units are treated separately within the biodiversity metric. So you can't therefore reduce one and replace with another. It's always necessary in order to meet the trading rules to achieve the net gain in each type of unit. So they put it as, or Natural England state, it cannot be summed, traded, or converted. So when considering these units, we also need to consider further points which have major impacts on providing a gain. So first of all, we've got distinctiveness, which is a measure based on a type of habitat and its distinguishing features. So this would include consideration of species richness, rarity, the extent of which the habitat is protected by designations, and a degree to which a habitat supports species rarely found in other habitats. So we're thinking there about red squirrels, bats, newts, if you're around Norfolk, otters in the Broads, those types of things. So that habitat will be designated a baseline distinctiveness from very low to very high, but losses can only be replaced by the same level of distinctiveness or higher. So if you go and reduce medium, you've got to replace it with more medium or higher than that, so high or very high. You can't replace it with lots of very low distinctiveness units. Then we've got linear or area habitat. So linear, very much as the name suggests, is recorded by length in kilometres. and area is instead recorded in hectares. So if you think back to the types of units, you can see obviously that hedgerows or lines of hedges would be analysed by length, so the linear unit or the linear type. You also need to consider strategic significance. So that is the local significance of the habitat based on its location and habitat type. So you might find some of these are actually irreplaceable, so they can't be reduced, they can't be destroyed, you can't go back and you can't add units in. So obviously any destruction is very much outside of the BNG network, so it shouldn't really be forming part of your overall plan. We've also got spatial risk. So where a project cannot achieve a net gain in biodiversity units on site, then off-site units can be used instead. So more biodiversity units are actually generated when the off-site location is within the same local planning authority or national character area as the on-site. So basically, the closer it is, the better, really. And finally, we also need to consider time. So enhancements already created are worth far more than those which don't currently form part of your plan. So all these different things are all compiled under the metric to provide an analysis of the units at the baseline, so what you're starting with, and then the units required to deliver that 10% gain or more.
Thank you, Callum. So first you'll need to calculate your pre-development value. That's the value of the site that you are developing within the red line, and this is calculated at what is referred to as the relevant date. Where you are seeking a planning permission by application, this will be at the date you apply for your planning permission. It is open to you to agree an earlier date with the local planning authority, but it can't be before the regime comes in. This, for example, this might be because you've carried out works that enhance your land prior to submitting the application and you want to capture these, but also it's in practical terms, it may be easier or simpler to agree a date. This is when we're assessing the land and that's our baseline. However, it's important to note that you can't do works to land that degrade the biodiversity value of your land, and because any works that have been carried out on the land since the 30th of January 2020 that result in a lower biodiversity value will mean that you'll have to use a relevant date prior to these works being carried out, unless these works are being carried out under planning permission or other permissions that are yet to be specified in the regulations. It's unclear how much this will impact what the ordinary use of the land, for example, agricultural land. And I've even seen suggestion that where you have a meadow that is then mown to create hay, you would have to use the value of the land prior to that mowing, even though this is use in the normal course of agriculture. Then moving on to the calculation of the post-development biodiversity value, you'll assess what your biodiversity value of your site will be following your development, and where you are unable to achieve the 10% enhancements, you will also have to look at using off-site units and perhaps even statutory credits. Where there is a decrease in the biodiversity value on site, you will need to compensate for this with increased units off-site or through the purchase of statutory credits. The local planning authorities and the government will enforce two mitigation hierarchies. The first of which is to attempt to avoid any negative impacts on habitats through your development, then to mitigate any of these impacts, and finally compensate for these. There is also a strong preference for the use of on-site enhancements and biodiversity provision, followed by off-site, and credits are very much seen as a last resort. As you'll see, you will need to be very much thinking about this throughout your application process, as you'll need to have taken your pre-development value at the time you apply, and you'll need to have a good idea of how you are going to provide these enhancements, whether on-site, off-site, or whether you'll need credits throughout your application. The local planning authorities will want to have a good understanding of how you intend to provide this by the time they grant your planning permission. And this is to the extent that we're seeing local planning authorities which have a biodiversity requirement under their current policy, even requiring developers to secure their off-site provision or on-site provision under their Section 106s to be entered as part of the planning application process. So moving on to the first option, on-site units. As I've said, these are very much the preferred option. These are enhancements and of biodiversity provided within your development site, and you'll need to provide these and then secure the management and maintenance of these for 30 years following the completion of these biodiversity enhancement works. And you'll need to show that these are secured by planning condition or Section 106 or conservation covenant for the 30 years for these to count towards your enhancements. There are a number of considerations that you'll need to take into account when providing on-site units, because first of all, you have to consider whether these enhancements are significant, as only significant enhancements will be counted towards your plan. It's not clear yet what the meaning of significant is, and we're waiting for guidance to be published to establish the level of enhancement that will meet this criteria. You'll also have to think about what, when and where these will be provided and how you will bring this forward, and whether there are any triggers within your plan, your obligations or your conditions that you will need to consider when bringing this forward. In addition to this being the preferred option, there are some benefits of choosing on-site enhancements, such as you will have much greater control over the provision, and you will be able to incorporate it into features that may already be pre-existing, such as sustainable urban drainage or your open space you're providing as part of the development. However, you'll also have to balance this out against the loss of development space and the cost of maintaining this land for the ongoing 30 years following the completion of these enhancements. The way we're seeing this work at the moment is these are being handed over to management companies, much as you would see with your open space on the developments. Another point is to consider what you will do after the end of this 30 years maintenance. Will you be required to carry out ongoing maintenance? Will you want to take this out of Biodiversity Net Gain? But we'll come on to this in more detail later in this presentation. There are also some opportunities with providing on-site units, such as in providing units over and above what is required by the mandatory 10% net gain and over and above the policy of the local planning authority. This can be a supporting reason for being granted approval by the local planning authority. The government has also said that you may be able to allocate excess biodiversity units provided to your own sites elsewhere, or even sell these as off-site units. And however, these gains will be treated as other off-site units and will need to be secured for 30 years, registered on the National Register, which Callum will come on to explain, and subject to the same reporting requirements as other off-site units. Unfortunately, it's unclear what exactly will be considered an excess biodiversity net gain unit is, whether this is all units provided on site over and above that mandatory 10%, or is it above all those provided over and above the policy requirements of the local planning authority, or all those that were considered as part of the application and were formed part of the reasons for granting the application. The government has said that excess units will be all those over the mandatory 10% and those units that were required to make the development acceptable in planning terms. As such, if your excess provision of biodiversity net gain formed a key element of to support the grant of planning permission, we'd be surprised if the local planning authorities was then happy for you to start allocating these excess units off to other sites, and so it will truly be those which are provided in excess which you will be able to sell or allocate to other sites.
Thanks, James. So what happens if you can't achieve the on-site 10% gain? So obviously that is a real risk, especially when we consider the overall cost of development. So you might find it's uneconomical to provide a 10% gain on site and still make a profit, or you may also find you're physically restrained from doing so. So you therefore may have no option but to combine your sort of on-site plan with delivery of habitat creation off-site. So there are various options on the marketplace, and these are likely to expand as the market matures. Obviously, the market at the moment is very much in its infancy. We're still trying to find our way through it, so we will likely see differences. But on the slide today, I've just put in some sort of different things we're starting to see. So first of all, developers can look to purchase that additional land to directly create a habitat plan, which then utilises the additional area to create biodiversity units. Another option we're seeing more readily available is securing an off-site location by contracting with a landowner or off-site provider. Off-site providers are often called land managers, and you'll see that in the sort of information supplied by DEFRA or Natural England. You'll see a lot of reference to that term. In this case, obviously, developers may be looking to lease and do those works themselves on that off-site, or they could potentially agree a contract where the landowner or off-site provider does this for them. Then we've also got the habitat bank creations. So we're seeing more of this within the marketplace. So organisations such as the Environment Bank are being set up, and they'll set up large biodiversity net gain schemes. So these schemes provide large numbers of units, differing in types and distinctiveness, as I spoke about earlier, which multiple developers can buy from. So you can have various different developers all going to the same scheme and buying units out from them. Obviously, you do need to remember this is very much separate from the statutory credit scheme. That's completely different. Obviously, this within the hierarchy, it is far better still to go to a bank than it would be to go to the statutory credits. Within each of these, it is really important to know that any land delivering off-site will need to be formally registered on the Biodiversity Net Gain register. Without that registration, you can't actually benefit from the units despite the enhancements taking place. There's actual forms online with Natural England or DEFRA to sign up and register that, and a specific number is given to the site. That's open to all public, but it's not to be used as a marketplace. You also need to consider the spatial measurement I discussed earlier. So again, the further away the off-site location is, the more you are penalised. So in simple terms, the bigger the gain you need to obtain from habitat creation should be from a site that's far more local to your on-site development. So there are lots of considerations here in relation to these, and they'll differ depending on whether you're a landowner or a developer. So first of all, we look at landowner considerations. We need to really think about the habitats that are required. So the marketplace will likely to start to show trends for various demands. For example, there could be a need for grassland. So as a landowner, you could think, do you have that, or can you create it? If you do create it, do you need to destroy anything to do so? You need to really think about distinctiveness here. So are you inadvertently removing very high distinctiveness with very low distinctiveness level? In which case you can't do that. So you've got to be really careful on how the plan is set up. Location really fits in this as well. So what is the need in the surrounding area? Is there local developments that require a habitat that you can provide? So you could be checking the local plan, speaking with local developers as well to see what really is required. So remember, again, I've repeated it a few times, but spatial. Your units could be worth more by being used close to that development. So by being created close to, if there is a development local to you. This obviously then flows into the type you can provide and their price. Obviously, we do have the statutory credit scheme, which does, in a way, act as a ceiling, but that's a very, very high ceiling because it's really a penalty provision. So, but you can look at those and you can just get a general understanding on how prices might differ depending on the various types of units being produced. Remember it as well, it is 30 years of management. So you could have a land manager do this for you. Alternatively, you can do it yourself, depending on what you've agreed. 30 years, though, is a really long time. So I think we always need to be thinking about the payment mechanism. So we're seeing in the marketplace a lot of upfront payments being made. That's great, but you do need to consider if you do have the required coverage from that upfront payment. So the management needs 30 years. You're going to have to deal with auditing requirements year on year. You might also need plant and machinery to manage that site. So, for example, a digger breaks, you could be in multiple of thousands of pounds to fix it. And still at the same time, you're still having to comply with your conservation covenants, but that does erode that original payment. So lots of caution is needed around that. Alternatively, you might think, okay, let's do a rental payment, let's spread it. But obviously, again, that also presents its own challenges. So you'll need to consider the strength of the party you're contracting with. Will they be around over that 30 years to pay rent from? Worst case is they fall away, you've got nobody to enforce against, you're not getting the rent, you're not getting the money for doing all the works, but you're still signed up to a conservation covenant, so you're still having to do them. So you could then have planning enforcing against you, but you're actually getting nothing on the back of it. Also, if you want to sell the site and you've received that upfront payment, you need to take into account, obviously, the value here. So you've actually realised the value by creating that plan, doing the works, you've taken the payment out. So we may see some devaluing of land, maybe. I think the agents will probably have more information about that, but it'll be interesting to see how that works. And really, again, what about the end of that 30 years, that long-term plan? If you're going to develop that land in the future, you will need to account for obviously the final development value. So you'd have to do a 10% gain on top of the already 10% gain you've done. So you could be quite a struggle to get that. Also, the government are starting to make taking a view that they don't want these sites coming out of the BNG network. So again, you may then be restricted from developing it into something else. So you can see, obviously, there is an enormous amount of variables here that need to be considered, both when holding on to land and when acting as a landowner.
Thank you, Callum. So I'm now going to look at this off-site units from the developer's point of view. As Callum set out, we're seeing three main options at the moment. That's purchasing off-site land to provide off-site units or using the developer's own land, taking a lease out over third-party land, or purchasing the value of the biodiversity enhancement of from, for example, a habitat bank. When considering these options as a developer, you'll need to consider how much control you need over this third-party provision. And this will very much depend on how your plan and the Section 106 and conditions of your development are structured. For example, the government has previously suggested that they'd require all off-site units to have been enhanced and the enhancements completed within 12 months of commencement of development of the site they're allocated to, or prior to occupation at the very latest. Whilst the government has rowed back on this, we may see local planning authorities trying to include these triggers within the structure of developments being brought forward. And so you may need to consider whether you need step-in rights and your relationship with a third-party provider. Where these enhancements have already been brought forward, you may be happier to have a more hands-off approach, and it will also depend on who the third-party provider is. There are also going to be monitoring requirements brought forward. So we need to consider who will be responsible for these and what kind of relationship you need with the offsite provider. And it may be the case that you need a contract or a direct relationship with that third-party provider to ensure you aren't caught out by any of these issues, particularly where the uplift is not achieved and this doesn't impact your ability to bring forward your development. Also, you need to think about, as Callum's talked about, payment mechanisms, and particularly what happens if you do not end up implementing your planning permission. You don't want to be caught out having paid out a large sum of money for offsite units for a development that you actually never bring forward, and so you may want to consider making these conditional or using conditional on the implementation of planning permission. Similarly, landowners won't want to be who are providing these offsite units won't want to be obliged to carry out these enhancements or allocate them to a development that is not actually being brought forward. However, when setting up these conditional contracts or agreements for lease, you need to be aware that any conditions relating to the provision of offsite units will have to be satisfied by the time you commence development or on commencement of development to allow you to include such biodiversity offsite units, but as part of your biodiversity net gain plan. Moving on to the third option, which is statutory credits, and these are very much to be considered a last resort. This is a system that the government is going to set up where a developer will be able to pay a set amount of money to the government, and the government will use this for their own mitigation and habitat enhancement projects. They've been priced accordingly, and as you can see, they're valued on distinctiveness type and type to be replaced, starting at £42,000 per credit for low distinctiveness, all the way up to £650,000 per credit for highly distinctive peat lakes. It's also important to note that one credit is worth only half a biodiversity net gain unit. So to achieve one unit of enhancement for low distinctiveness is going to cost you £84,000 and over £1 million for one unit of peat lake high distinctive units. Also, the government has suggested that if you wish to use the statutory credit regime, you're going to have to provide evidence to the local planning authority as to why you're not able to achieve the 10% gain on site or through purchase of off-site units. And they consider this, as we've said, very much a last resort. Now we've considered the standard process for full applications. I'll quickly take a look at phased applications and developments, and also what happens when you vary under section 73. Where you have an outline permission or a phased development, the government has suggested that you'll need to provide a much greater amount of information at the start of the development and as part of the application process to show how you're going to achieve that 10% gain on site across the entire site. There will then be a biodiversity net gain plan for each reserve matters approval. However, each reserve matters approval will not have to individually provide this 10% gain within that reserve matters area, is because the government accepts that for large sites, you often have reserve matters approvals, for example, bringing forward a large amount of open space, which will be easily providing lots of biodiversity enhancements, whereas single residential parcels may not be able to achieve this 10% on its own. There'll also be no need to front load the development, despite the government's earlier suggestions to allow flexibility for the local planning authorities, but we are expecting them to prefer front loading or early provision of biodiversity to ensure that we don't have large schemes almost entirely built out and still they haven't provided the enhancements to achieve that 10%. It's unclear at the moment, though, with these individual plans for each reserve matters approval, where your outline is going to need to provide off-site units or biodiversity statutory credits, which plan these will be included in, and whether there will in fact be a separate plan to bind these to the site. But this we hope to be clarified by the regulations coming out. Moving on to variations using section 73 of the Town and Country Planning Act. Once again, we're still waiting for these to be set out in the regulations, but it's been suggested by the government that this mandatory 10% gain regime will only affect a section 73 variation where the original planning permission was caught by this regime. As such, if you have existing planning permissions and then you vary them using section 73 after the regime comes into force, these would not be subject to this new requirement. Once this does come into force, when you vary using section 73, you will need to use the original pre-development value for that original application as your baseline, and this is so developments aren't impacted by having carried out enhancements on site already, or where they've reduced the on-site biodiversity value. It's also likely that you'll only need to resubmit your plan where the variations are having an impact on the biodiversity provision and biodiversity value of the site. Finally, what are we waiting for? The regulations governing this haven't been published yet, but the government has announced that they should be published by the end of November, and we're expecting about 6 sets of regulations to govern various aspects of the biodiversity gain. The government is also going to be releasing an increasing amount of guidance over the next month or so, and we're hoping that this will provide clarity on some of the areas that we're waiting for. Though I'm sure with this new regime, there will be some teething problems which will take some time to work themselves out. A few of the main areas, as we've already alluded to, that we're waiting for regulations are the exact requirements and structures of how off-site gains are going to be allocated to developments, secured and securing their ongoing maintenance. Also clarification on how the government will deal with planning permissions that are not implemented. The legislation surrounding the statutory credit regime suggests there will be a repayment mechanism for statutory credits, and so this suggests that there will be some similar releases relating to off-site units where a planning permission is not implemented, and we expect this to be done in the condition by making these conditional within the section 106, as you would expect to see obligations being conditional for your other obligations in section 106 regimes at the moment. Also, enforcement. How will this work in practice? The local planning authorities will be able to use their planning enforcement powers to enforce the biodiversity net gain regime, but it's not clear how exactly this will work, where you have a development in one local planning authority's area and the off-site provision, for example, is in the adjacent local planning authority's area. who will be responsible for that enforcement, and whether it will be expedient for those local planning authorities to enforce. Also, and finally, what happens after 30 years? The government has said that they hope that none of the biodiversity land will be taken out of biodiversity enhancements, and DEFRA has recently signalled that they hope that this will be then used for further biodiversity enhancements. These will also be, it's also been suggested these will be incentivized by things such as tax regimes relating to biodiversity, and also it will be where you have a change of use development from the biodiversity gain, you'll have to take into account the enhanced value of this land. Thank you very much for listening. I'll now hand over to Andrea for any questions.
Thanks, James and Callum. We have had a few questions start to arrive. If I just start with you, Callum, if I may, with the question around kind of practicalities that's been raised by one of our attendees, which is whether our thoughts are that the planning authorities and developers who are looking to landowners to provide BNG units will seek, really detailed evidence of the implementation of the promise of activity within, say, a habitat management plan, leading to the gain that the developer is promising to the planning authority and that the planning authority is itself relying on in order to give the permission. So it's a question around kind of robust structures and security.
I think indications are that there will be a robust structure around that. I think the auditing requirements are needing to provide that sort of ecological assessments year on year to highlight the habitat creation and the ongoing enhancements. I think that will ensure that these are done. So I think it's going to be, doing this and then thinking you can just leave the land and it'll be fine, and then sort of not really comply, is going to be very difficult. Obviously, it does come down to resources, though. See, I think it's James has said, but the planning enforcement officers, are they going to have the capability to go to each of these sites? If there's loads of them in the marketplace, it's probably then going to become quite difficult to do so. So I think there's going to be a balance there.
Thank you. Question perhaps more for James, but either of you can answer. Do we know the policy reason, and so the logic for credits not matching the BNG units, not one for one?
I think they are very much a penalty. They're seen as a last resort. So when you're looking at the hierarchy, they are the last thing you will be going for. You've really got to highlight why you can't actually, one, realise the gain on site, two, why you can't deal with it off site. And then at that stage, if you then go into the credit scheme, obviously you're in a pretty bad situation. So they're then using that very high price point and then a doubling up as well to really put you off of doing it.
Okay. Thanks for that, Callum. I mean, it's clear to me that the idea is to have each development scheme with the benefit on site, if at all possible. All directions head that way. And one of our attendees has asked the question whether we think that a buyer of, I'm assuming this is a residential scheme envisaged, so a buyer who was facing taking on an individual unit or an individual home within a new development, which has signed up to obligations around BNG units, and they might have long-term associated costs with that, may be kind of off-put by the payment compared to somebody who is looking at a scheme where the net gain is entirely off-site and dealt with by third parties. It's kind of a market question.
To sort of individual dwellings and the gardens and things like that. So normally you'd see in a section 106 that's binding on the individual householders would be exempt from the section 106, so the obligations wouldn't be enforceable against that individual. Well, it's unclear. There's a little bit of competition between what the legislation says at the moment and what the guidance is saying in relation to gardens and individual dwellings. The legislation at the moment simply says that the biodiversity enhancements will have to be secured for 30 years. However, the guidance is suggesting that while you may be able to use the fact that you have a number of gardens as part of your scheme, as part of your biodiversity value, these will all be valued at a low distinctiveness type, and it will be taken into account that a certain percentage will be taken out of the biodiversity gain. For example, individuals putting down decking or converting it to artificial grass or such like. So this will be taken into the metric when calculating that post value. And so we're not expecting the biodiversity controls to be enforceable against individuals, but this will need to be clarified in the regulations and set out exactly how this is going to work.
Thanks, James. I think then the question about what the impact will be on cost, I mean, my view would be it's going to come out in the wash one way or another, because it's all part of the developer's assessment of viability for a whole scheme, whether they go off-site or whether they have long-term maintenance obligations that might sit on site and sit on a manco, if not directly enforceable against those individual house owners. So another one here for Callum, who's very much the coalface of these type of agreements, which is, in the absence presently of clear guidance on the allocation of off-site units, how do we see the progress of live BNG agreements that are in circulation? Are they conditional contracts? Are people committing and hoping for the best?
It's very much a case-by-case basis, I think, on this. There are obviously, there are conditional contracts coming through, and on that basis, we're taking the sort of enormous amount of literature on the regulations that we've had so far, using that as a sort of way in which we can draft them, and obviously taking account of both knowns, so things we know will come up, and then unknowns as well. So you just have to be very careful of that, because obviously there's going to be certain areas where there might be an issue at a later date, and there may therefore in the future need variations to those contracts, because it's not cemented yet until the end of November. So it does prove a challenge, but we are seeing conditional contracts being put in place for those units.
Brilliant. And a technical question now for James. On larger schemes, where there might be an outline planning permission and reserve matters coming through, what is the cut-off date? So if there were an outline planning permission granted in 2018 and a developer was about to submit a reserve matters application in scenario where the 10% mandatory is in place, are they going to be caught, or will they not be caught for that single reserve matters application?
I don't know. I don't know 100%, but I think that it's only applications that are submitted. So the outline application would have to be submitted under the new regime. It'd be very surprising if they suddenly were trying to catch existing sites. But this one I'll just have to take away and confirm shortly.
And of course, everything is uncertain until we have these regulations that we've been waiting for with bated breath for certainly many months, and lots of reading when it arises. So I think we've probably got time for one or two further questions. We were talking earlier on about excess and government confirming that excess is going to be over and above what's needed to get the actual planning application through in the views of the planning authority. Where are we seeing that information? Has that come through in guidance, or is it commentary? Will it be firmed up when the regulations come through? So the question is essentially, how certain are we that excess is over and above what's needed to get the planning application through?
So that line comes from the government's response to the Biodiversity Net Gain consultation that was carried out in 2022, and the response was published in 2023. But we're hoping that this will be set out either in official guidance or regulations that are set to be published over the next month and a half.
Great stuff. And I think to close then, one for Callum perhaps, which is how do we foresee the market for BNG? The question is credits. I think it's possibly the market for BNG units, given the overall amount of planning applications that go through in a year, the fact that many are in potentially the south, where there is agricultural land with a low habitat value to date. Is there going to be a requirement on almost every planning application that comes through? Is this going to be an absolute sea change, or are we going to see it very much on the housing developments or the large commercial schemes, and less in a very biodiverse existing site? So if you are just looking at, say, putting a couple of houses on a plot of agricultural land, then what are the chances of this being relevant?
I think that probably goes back to James's point in the presentation around de minimis, and whether or not you're exceeding that or not. Obviously, where you are exceeding it, then yes, in those situations you are going to then have to show that gain. And obviously, in those types of sites, it might be easier where you've got low density to find that gain on site. Obviously, if you're changing it that way, rather than having to go off-site or utilising other areas.
Thanks, Callum. One of our attendees has asked the question of whether we think this might introduce delays in the planning process. My take is that everything introduces delays into the planning process, so I won't ask the panel that question. It would be great if it's streamlined somehow. Highly unlikely. But I think we need to wrap up there and close and let you get on with your day. So those of you who've added your name to any questions that we haven't got to today, then we will endeavour to send you a note by email if we have your details. Otherwise, feel free to contact any of us directly. And thank you for attending.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.